So, hello, I'm Alison Cornish, and I teach here at NYU in the Italian department at the Casa Italiana at Zerilli-Marimò. And I'm here today with my friend Martin.
Hello, I'm Martin Eisner. I teach at Duke in North Carolina. We have different weather than you have at NYU, but we get to talk today on Zoom. So it's very nice. I'm very excited, Alison, by the way.
So am I.
Big responsibility of doing Inferno 5, you know?
Yes, I kind of nabbed Inferno 5 to make sure that, well, of course, I grabbed it greedily for myself, but I thought, who would I like to talk about Inferno 5 with? I'd like to talk with Martin Eisner. So we have been planning this for a while, and finally today we're doing it. And so we thought we'd start maybe with Martin about this canto and what's particular about this canto.
Sure. Yeah. No. I think my backdrop speaks volumes for what what I was thinking about talking about, which is just the way that this canto excites readers in such different ways to and I'll kind of talk a little bit about the painting behind me, that the way it's balanced between the sympathy and the sort of moving emotion of Francesca on the one hand, and on the other side you have in the darkness there Dante looking rather sternly at her, even as he's, as we know from reading the Canto, quite moved. So I think that dialectic and that tension in the Canto is what has drawn readers to it so much. What do you find, Alison? Is that true for your classes?
It does sort of divide the readership, right? There's the sort of pro-Francesca crowd and the anti-Francesca crowd, and I think the two of us sort of see it as precise. It lies there in that tension between the two. Just looking at Virgil there, and he seems to be more full of pity than Dante looks, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Certainly structurally, this is an important canto because it is the first sin that we deal with, because up until now we've met only the neutrals or the lukewarm, the tepid, who didn't take a stand about anything, and then the people in limbo who, far from being sinners, are actually extremely virtuous, the virtuous pagans and so forth. So this is the first sin, and it sort of stands in paradigmatically as a paradigm for all sin, not just for the particular sin of lust. And so maybe we want to talk a little bit about structure, about how we get into this canto that sometimes we skip over, running to Francesca. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, it's hard to resist just running to Francesca, as we already did. But those first few lines are full of a level of precision and architectural precision that I think we would probably do well to linger on for a second. So, from the very first line, del cerchio primaio giù nel secondo, so from the first circle into the second. And as so often with Dante, the most unassuming thing is kind of one of the most powerful, which is that, oh wait, there's a second circle, right? There's a carefully structured sequence here that he's walking us through, that he's journeying through. And Alison, as you were just saying about the paradigm, and we get to see Minos circling his tail, telling the souls where they're going to go. So we have this lovely precision of, the crime and the punishment will match up. We're in the second, which suggests there's going to be a third, and we have this kind of structural home that we're walking through, this structural space.
So that's really about order, right? And this is a sin that whose punishment, and again, being the paradigm for all sin, whose punishment expresses what the sin is like, is kind of being chaotically in bad weather, being in a bufera infernal. And so Minos, being the person who's given the bureaucrat, right, who's been given the task to distinguish between one sin and another, but not only that, to put labels on people and saying, well, of all of your sins, the one that really pegs you is this one. And that requires rational order, but also it's kind of an art. And that's why it's such a lovely phrase, right? He's the conoscitor, the connoisseur, conoscitor delle peccata, connoisseur of sins. And he has a tail. Okay. We don't first meet Francesca. In fact, that's one of the odd things is that we really made the greatest ladies of erotic literature and of out of history and out of all of those people. And who would you like to talk to? Cleopatra. And Dante chooses Francesca. But maybe you want to start with some of those queens that are mentioned at the outset.
Yeah, it's such an interesting sort of gallery, and we had some in limbo, some women, but we finally get these really famous lovers, and you can feel Dante kind of reaching into history here too. I mean, just as he's like from the first to the second, situating us in his poem and the space that it's traversing. Here too, he's bringing us back into history. So the first figure we meet is the first figure, the figures of civilization after the flood, right? So he's reaching back to like the origins or the roots of human history that he then walks us through up to Francesca. I mean, he knows he's putting Francesca on the world stage here. He knows he's putting her in this illustrious company. And with Dido too, right? So, Dido, I think, is so important to see there, especially because I think one of the things that Dante is up to here is trying to think about the power of literature and the power of reading. And of course, weeping over Dido has been a major theme in Augustine. And, what that leads Augustine to do is say, those literary texts are terrible, right? Like, how dare me, how horrible it was for me to weep over Dido. But Dante seems to be a little bit more, have a much more complicated sense. Not that Augustine's not complicated, but he doesn't want to cast away the texts. And I think sometimes this canto gets read that way, that Dante wants to condemn courtly literature, he wants to condemn their way of reading. But I think it's more, to come back to the background, right? It's more double. There are two sides to it, I think.
Yeah, and to in keeping with your original observation about structure and the sort of foundation or refoundation of civilization after the flood, and Semiramis, the first queen that we meet, she's a lawgiver. She's an empress. She's the empress of many tongues, Dante calls her. And she's the one who, in kind of a word play, makes libido licit in order to marry her son, if I'm not mistaken. So what's also going on here is law, like the foundation of society around law and around things like the codification of sexual relations, right, is such a fundamental thing to all civilizations, but we could say just more generally culture. And why is the incest taboo so foundational to all societies and so forth? It's really, yes, it's not just the personal, it's very much the large. And so there is a kind of punning here in this canto about, maybe that's to put it superficially, but about the law and about reading, right? Legge, right? That and how going outside the law and sort of going and whether texts lay down the law or whether there's what that has to do with order and personal experience, how those two things sort of mesh.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, and if you for those of you who are conoscitor of Italian, there's a play there on legge and legge, on reading and law, that Dante is, like you said, more than punning on, I guess, in this play. Yeah.
So we've already gotten into the idea of we're reading about reading. We've already sort of intimated that. It's also very different things are on display literarily, genre, rhetoric, things like that. I mean, I think you said you were surprised that Dante could write such a love story. Why do you say you were surprised?
Yeah, well, I think when we come from the Vita Nuova to the Commedia, we don't sort of expect the narrative involvement. The Vita Nuova kind of keeps us at a distance, even as Dante revisits suffering through love. He does control that, right? He has a frame for it. But I feel like the narrative genius of this canto, if I come to it from the other earlier Dante texts, I find it really unexpected. Yeah.
Of course,
How about you? Do you find that?
the point of view of the woman, right? That's always the what people remark upon, right? Finally, the woman talks back, or the woman's experience of love. Whereas, of course, in love poetry, we generally get the male perspective. So there is that. So maybe we should talk about how she kind of quotes literature. Yeah. Well,
No. Well, I'm curious. What do you, when you teach, as we both do? So, which parts do you read? Because I can't. There's so many exciting parts of it. There's her. I sometimes pull in Joyce's Ulysses for the rhyme words, which she reutilizes there, or the repetition of amor, or these like parallel structures. This is. I don't know, which are your favorites that you pull out for students or fellow readers?
Yeah, I think we should certainly talk about the anaphora, the repetition of amor, amor cal cor gentil ratto s'apprende, prese costui dalla bella persona che mi fu tolta, in modo ancor m'offende, amor che nulla amato, amar perdona, mi prese del costui piacer si forte, che come vedi ancor non m'abbandona, amor condusse noi ad una morte. So it's so wonderful because she gets the whole story is all there, right? I mean, the facts are sort of laid out. Facts as she'd like us to know them, which is that everything happened to her. People talk about agency a lot, and agency is given to Amor, who seems to be the god of love, right? Who is a scary guy, right? Once he gets you, it's not fun. And she also says that the first person to fall in love in this relationship was the unnamed Paolo, and that it happened by means of her persona, which is her body. She was very beautiful, she tells us, a bella persona, and that's what did it. And reciprocally, she fell in love with his piacer, which is sort of coming out of this love poetry from Provence. So plaisir is the physical attractiveness of a person, and still that attraction, she says, has not abandoned her, even though the body that she fell in love with would not be present in hell. And she also references the fact that she no longer has her own body, and the way she lost it, she finds very offensive still. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, it would lead you to tell like an elaborate story about it, right? If you were Boccaccio, you'd be like, "Wow, this I should tell a story about all of this."
Yeah, it's almost like it leaves us wanting more, and that's definitely what Dante does. So, oh, wait a minute, tell me, like you have all the facts, but you want to hear more. And so, yeah, why don't you talk a little bit about what our friend Giovanni Boccaccio did with this?
Yeah, I mean, so Boccaccio is moved by as so many readers are, certainly in the 19th century, right? They're so. The representation of Francesca breaks the bounds of the theological structure in which she appears for these readers, and so the moment is to be to feel with her the suffering that she's experiencing, and Boccaccio is among the first to kind of put that reading into a text where he gives a whole backstory for Francesca that makes the marriage the product of a bed trick. She thinks she's sleeping with the beautiful brother, and then winds up in the morning with winds up the next morning, that she's married this other one. So there's it's not her fault. So Boccaccio sort of follows the Francesca's own narrative of it's not my responsibility. I was tricked by these men in Boccaccio's version, which of course is a close reading of this, but not not what Dante has in mind.
There's something about love stories that they make us want to elaborate or want to know, and what are the details, and how pretty was she, and what outfit was she wearing, and what did he look like, and how was his hair, and all of this kind of detail. And Boccaccio, because we as readers are always looking for those details, then people go to immediately to Boccaccio and assume that those are the facts of the case. And I think Boccaccio sort of knew that we would do that or something, because that really ironic line at the very end, he says, whether or not they met in the way that Dante describes here, I have no idea. He may have invented it. It's like, oh, he's inventing. Yeah, right. Okay. So,
Right.
yeah. So yeah, let's just talk about the scene of reading before we run out of time. And
yeah, so the reading together is such a powerful scene that Boccaccio himself, of course, will take up when he writes the Decameron. Galeotto fu libro e chi lo scrisse, right? So Francesca continues to push responsibility elsewhere. It was the book's fault. It was the author of the book's fault. It wasn't my fault.
Remind everybody that Galeotto is the character in the book that she's reading, Galahad, and he is the go-between. He's the pander. He's the person who gets them together. So the book itself, and therefore all books, are intermediaries in that way, because they get us to fall in love with things or believe certain things, or right. And so Boccaccio in the Decameron subtitled the Decameron, which was a book for ladies, he said. He subtitled it Galahad, which sort of suggests, is this a good idea to give it to your daughters? And I think he even said in a letter, don't give it to your daughters, if you really care about your daughters. But what about what about thinking about women reading, right? You have some things to say about women reading.
That scene of reading that Boccaccio queries, right? Like, is this how they fell in love? Like, why does Dante invent this? And if you go back to look at visual representations of women reading in general, it really emerges around 1200, and you get images of Mary, the Virgin Mary, reading. And it's usually thought she's reading Isaiah, the prophecy of virgin birth. And there are lots of echoes between that scene. Think of the doves, for example. The fact that what they read becomes manifest. There are lots of echoes between those two scenes that I think is part of Dante telling us that we should be able to be overcome by texts, right? That it's okay, but that we have to do it somehow, read responsibly or something, if it were an ad campaign.
It is true about all of our reading. When we read something and we find that moment of identification with an author, and it's like, I know what he's talking about. I felt that way. That corresponds to my life, right? It really is the key to reading. When reading is worthwhile, is with that moment of revelation that somehow you've glimpsed a truth, right? Is what is, and that remains true, even though that this is her downfall. She thinks she's seen something, and she equates it. I always read that line. She says, when we read that the desired smile was kissed by so great a lover, this one, unnamed, Paolo, kissed my mouth all trembling. And when you think about how she was really in love with Lancelot, that she considered to be so great a lover, to be kissed by this other guy must have been a little bit startling. And then the phrase, who never shall be parted from me, which in the romantic period that is represented behind you, would be taken as triumphant, right? Love conquers all. Love survives even death. Love doesn't pay attention to the rules or to law or to even God's authority, because it's just this free agent. Instead, if you read it, that he never shall be parted from me, when you think about how maybe that wasn't the person she really was in love with, that's a pretty bad punishment. And she does say she's very unhappy. So I think being stuck with Paolo might not be the great joy that some people say it is. Yeah. And the other thing that I've been thinking a lot lately is that when she's trying to be so gracious, and she really is gracious to Dante, responding to his desire to talk to them, because that's what she responds to, because love pardons no one from loving in return. And she says, if the king of the universe were my amico, se fosse amico re dell'universo. And of course, amico in erotic literature means lover. What she's sort of suggesting is that, unfortunately, her lover is not that high up. He's not that well placed. And so she's not able to do the kind of favors that she could do for a visitor that she would have. Too bad, right? But then you get this sort of idea that it's not just that it wasn't Lancelot that she kissed, but that the first lover, the greatest lover, the one who really loved her first, might have been God himself. And that's the reading that was possible there that she didn't make.
Yeah, and I love what you're saying about that we want that reading to be powerful for us too, because I think that's what we see in that like Dante's created a scene that will move us, that it moves him, right? I mean, the pilgrim faints there at the end, so I feel like that where he's built a structure that allows him to have us be moved at the same time that he has built that allows us to see clearly how we're supposed to evaluate that, right? That shouldn't be the only thing. We shouldn't only be moved. We should be able to
only want to weep for Dido, right? That's Augustine talks about how he loved weeping for Dido, right? That we love the sadness of the story. Why are we in love with the sadness of love, and even the love that leads to death, which this is? And another comment you made before when we were talking about this is how Boccaccio writes his Decameron. He says, for ladies, because poor things, they're always stuck in their rooms and they can't go out, which is our circumstance at the moment, because we're in lockdown. And so this desire to read books or listen to canto per canto discussions of books becomes all the more important in our current situation. Right.
But we want to encourage people to read responsibly too.
Well, how would you suggest they do that?
Well, I think that comes back to like the whole structure thing, right? Like where Dante wants us to, unlike Augustine, who says like, my literary education was foolish. It kept me away from the really important things. I think Dante allows it to exist, right? I mean, it's there, and then he replicates it in the story of Francesca, right? Creates this moving scene where the pilgrim faints, but then he puts it in a structure that makes it clear where it exists in this set of values, and that it shouldn't be the value that displaces all other things. But that doesn't mean that it should be dispensed with completely, which is the Augustinian sort of reaction to Dido. So it's an incredibly clever way to maintain a tradition that you also see yourself as surpassing, but whose powers you don't want to censor, I think is what I would say.
And the main power is the power, not just of love, but of the love story, and there's a whole tradition too of the erotic in the Song of Songs, that leveraging that clearly erotic language is sort of the language we need to really talk about God, for example, in a way that matters and not in a kind of just the judge of us and so forth. Loving God is a kind of erotic situation, and that's why this is an important canto.
And we could say, I mean, even if I know we'll have other people coming along to talk about Paradiso, and some already have. But of course, Dante's not going to dispense with that desire that you just described, right? That love from the Song of Songs. That's going to be live and well as we go up through Paradiso. Yeah.
The engine of the whole thing. So that triple amor, amor, amor. That's kind of what the whole Divine Comedy is about, what it ends on. And on that note, I think we should probably end because we're running out of time, but we could keep going. So thank you so much, Martin, for talking with me about Francesca, about which I've learned a lot from you. So,
likewise, it's so fun. We need another like 20 minutes or 40 minutes, but we can do that separately.
All right. Ciao.
Ciao.